Hello and welcome back to Climate Solutions News. I'm Dominic Shales. Today I'm looking forward to what I'm sure will be another fascinating conversation with Tom Rollason from Mission Zero Technologies. The company's developing an electrochemical approach to direct air capture, and Tom's just returned from COP30, where engineered carbon removals received far more attention than in previous years. So look forward to hearing more about that. So we'll explore what that means for the DAC sector, how policy and funding are shifting, and where Mission Zero sees the most credible path to scale. So welcome, Tom, and thanks for joining us. Do start off by giving a little background about yourself, about Mission Zero Technologies, and the role that you have there.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. Thanks for having me. I'm lead of policy and partnerships at Mission Zero Technologies. We are a direct air capture company, as you mentioned, headquartered and based in the UK. Although we now have operational plants in both the UK and in Canada. You can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from the UK. I'm originally Australian, and have worked quite a bit of my career in either national or federal governments, and then also on the private sector side. So can sort of talk that that language between policymakers and private enterprise, which has been quite handy, and certainly what we do, or what I do at Mission Zero is try to bridge that gap between public policy and a clean tech startup that is rapidly scaling up.
That's great. And tell us a little bit more about Mission Zero and actually what you do and what stage of development you're at.
Yeah, so Mission Zero was started in 2020, 5 years ago, by three co-founders. We have, as you mentioned, an electrochemical process for removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So we are a direct air capture company. We sort of bring in CO2 from the air using sort of large industrial fans. We then contact it with a liquid solvent, and we sort of dissolve that CO2 and other particles into the solvent. So we sort of make, like we say, a fizzy drink that doesn't fizz, and we hold that in a vat, and then we pass that through a sort of a membrane, which we apply an electrodialysis process to, which releases the CO2 on the other side as a gaseous molecule. We've tested that at with a third-party verification. It's something in the realm of 97 to 98% purity, so very high purity of the CO2 coming out as a gas. And then we loop the solvent back around so that we can reuse that in the next capture process. So
And you're operational, right?
Yeah, we're operational. As I said, we've got three plants. One I would say is on the pilot scale. That's in Sheffield, and then we have another one that's quite a bit larger, sort of 5 times the scale. That's in Norfolk, and then our most recent deployment as of late August, which is in Canada, in Alberta.
And what are people doing with the carbon dioxide that you capture? Are they using it for food and or other industrial processes? What's happening to it?
Yeah, so really interestingly, each of our deployments so far tests a different pathway for CO2. So the first one in Sheffield is partnered with the University of Sheffield as testing end-to-end processes for direct air capture and how it might be used with sustainable aviation fuels. On the back of that, we've also been part of a consortium that got some UK federal government funding as part of the Advanced Fuels Fund to test a similar methodology, but at a larger scale. So we're doing a feed study with a consortium of partners to test DAC to sustainable aviation fuels. The second plant, which is in Norfolk, is using the captured and removed CO2 as a component for building aggregates. So we're partnered with a company called OCO Technologies. They have a proprietary technology that makes what is in essence a manufactured limestone. And by adding the CO2 that we've captured from the air, they're now making a carbon negative building aggregate that you can put into cement blocks, concrete blocks, roads, pavements, things like that. And the third plant is in Canada, in Alberta, where we've partnered with Deep Sky, which is a project developer, and they're testing carbon removed from the atmosphere to then be sequestered durably in a geological structure, also in Canada. And what was quite impressive is there's another couple of companies on that site. They're testing, I think it's at the moment 6 different direct air capture companies and their technologies. So we're on site with some of our competitors, but also, sort of, friends in the field. Some of our CO2 was captured and then purified and liquefied and then transported and sequestered. And that was the first time that CO2 taken directly from the air had been durably stored in the ground anywhere in North America. So that was a pretty, amazing milestone for us and for them.
Very good. And I think that gives a good indication of the broad range of scope of how the captured CO2 can actually be used across multiple different projects and storage methods, etc. And in terms of scale, give us some numbers if you can, just in terms of how much you're capturing at the moment, what the potential is, how efficient it is to remove directly from the air.
Yeah, so at the moment, our first plant is a 50 ton per annum pilot, as I said. The next 2 in Norfolk in Canada are 5 times that, so 250 tons. We're now looking at, I guess, a lot of the work that we're doing is engineering a next generation system, which will be an order of magnitude again, probably 4 to 5 times that. So that'll be something that we believe that we can then modularize and scale, and so we can have several of those units creating the tonnage that is appropriate to the end user. So it's very much with the kind of end user, end customer in mind.
And what about the energy required to actually do the capture? Because skeptics always point to to that the input figure as being you know large in its own right, and counteracting the positive effects of the carbon dioxide removal. How does that work in your plants?
Yeah, so ours uses, as you mentioned at the top, an electrochemical process. So our inputs are electricity and water, and so that is a much more energy efficient way of doing direct air capture. I will note that just to mention that the capture part is relatively energy efficient. It's the release part where you're trying to get the CO2 out of the solution or out of the sorbent if you do it through a solid state process as some of the other DAC companies do. It's really once you've captured the CO2, that's sort of the easy part. It's then releasing it, which is the energy intensive part, and that's something that we've been working to bring down. But certainly our process compared to some of our competitors is much more energy efficient, and it's something that our engineering team is working, I think, sort of fixated on how to bring that energy efficiency down as low as possible.
Great. Let's turn back to COP. I mentioned at the top that you'd just been in Brazil. I think you've been suffering for a few days as a result of of the flight back as well. But how was it? Because I think the general consensus is that it was disappointing in terms of outcomes. How did you find it? What were the kind of highlights and lowlights for you?
Yeah, I think it's about expectation setting. So I think there was a concerted effort on the part of the presidency to move away from sort of large and ambitious targets. We're sort of past a target phase and into an implementation phase. Of course, that's where the real work is, and that's where it gets messy. And I think it was certainly a little messy. I think on a positive frame of mind, I think, well, just trying to draw some positives, there is a growing consensus that I think this is the COP where carbon dioxide removals sort of came of age. There's sort of less caveating that this is, in addition to removals, I think, reductions. I think that's taken as read. I think a large part of that is how important carbon removals is part of the IPCC report, but also the real, damning reality that we are on track to overshoot 1.5. I guess one of the positive things that came out of the agreement was a recognition to return to 1.5 degrees once surpassing it, and that will increase a need for carbon removals in the future as well. I think positively, this was the first time that a COP had featured a dedicated pavilion for carbon dioxide removals, again showing how this sector is coming of age and the growing importance it will have now and into the future. I think sort of regrettably we're on that path that has put far too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and we need to remove as much of it as quickly as possible, and make sure that we don't put any more up in the meantime.
I mean, there was definitely a lot more discussion about adaptation than there has been in the past, which is rather depressing. But because it obviously means that we've got to a certain point where there's no real alternatives but to try and adapt. But it's good that direct air capture was getting more of a play. Do you think there were any tangible policy or commitments towards direct air capture coming out of it, or do you think it's really a question of lots of good words and not enough action still?
No, I think aside from the good words and a growing recognition that this is an essential part of what countries will have to be doing as part of their NDCs, so their nationally determined contributions, and not just something that we might have to deal with in the future. It's an essential component. There was for the first time a high level action champion for carbon removals, Chris Neidl, who has been a champion for the industry without that title for a long time. The action agenda is probably something that sits alongside the negotiated text. And so it's something that sort of civil society and private sector and companies work alongside the negotiated text from at a country level. And so there was some positivity there. There was kind of an implementation target that, again, it wasn't a new target. It was just a reiteration of a target that had already existed that was created by Mission Innovation, which is a consortium of countries working together on clean energy R&D. And that's to get 100 million tons of technological CDR by 2030. And how we get there is what came out of this COP. So that was a concerted effort to have sort of three pillars. One is the business side, one is the policy side, and one is, I think, one that's quite exciting is an industrial side. So what I mean by is, so the business side is led by the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. That's looking at voluntary private sector demand. So how to share lessons around purchasing, supplying that demand, mainly through voluntary mechanisms. But as we move into more compliance-based markets, that will be important. The policy side is driven by GONE, the group of negative emitters, which is led by Denmark, with some other, I think, really ambitious countries who are setting a pathway for how to reach negative emissions by 2050. And on the industrial integration side, it's looking how industry can use or utilize CO2 as a way of not just removing it, but then creating a market for it. And I think that's really exciting.
Great, very good. And I mean, do you still see big barriers preventing more wide scale rollout, or do you think, or I suppose what are the barriers and how can you overcome them? That's probably a better way of putting it.
Yeah, I think there still are some structural barriers. I think one is this idea of additionality, that there needs to, you have to be kind of in tandem as doing project development for direct air capture. You need to be also kind of project developing or procuring renewable electricity. So I think just the availability or an abundancy of cheap renewable electricity is what is kind of needed for direct air capture and virtually all climate tech industries. I still think that there needs to be a kind of a more compliance-based market. At the moment, it's very voluntary for those who want to purchase carbon removals. but having something that is a mandated compliance based market would help at least stimulate that demand side. And I think as companies sort of scale, there is a financing gap in between getting that initial innovation grant funding and then getting the kind of mature financing that you need to create a commercial scale project.
And what's Mission Zero's financing situation? What have you raised, and from where?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we raised a Series A at the beginning of last year, where we had a number of climate tech VCs on board, so notably Breakthrough Energy Ventures, 2150, and World Fund, but also combined with some, I would say, industrial strategics, so Fortescue, Anglo American, and Siemens Financial. Siemens. So those, I think, show a large corporate or industrial desire to see how to integrate direct air capture into sort of industrial sectors in which they can best use it.
And are you looking at another raise anytime soon, a Series B?
Not in the sort of immediate future, but I think we're always open to talking to investors and sort of gauging what the market mood is, and yeah, I think we'll always door is always open to having those conversations.
And let's look a little bit at cost structures as well. So obviously, buyers of CO2 for whatever purpose want to get the best quality gas at the lowest possible cost, and the cost of direct air capture is still relatively high. What are you seeing about the trajectory of those costs, and kind of where do you think it could land in future as the market grows and as the technology gets better?
Mm. I think in terms of specific costs, it's hard to say. I think that's something that we've found is that it does depend on the industry. So if you're going after a company that just wants to buy a direct removal, that'll have a price point. If you're going to compete with merchant CO2, um, then you've got a relatively volatile market in which prices can kind of plummet and soar. Increasingly in the UK, they're looking quite constrained. So I think there's a little bit of long-term or medium-term uncertainty in the price of CO2 in the UK. And then if it's up against, if you talk about whether it's a comparison against some of the prices that other companies pay for CO2, it can vary. I think what we've been trying to do is bring our costs down as much as possible, and that does relate to energy efficiency. We believe we have one of the most energy efficient approaches to DAC, um, and I think what we will need to do is continue to iterate on that. And I think what we've learned is through development and through deployment, you can achieve cost reductions. Every time we deploy, we get cheaper, we get faster, and we improve the engineering of our system. So I think in terms of some of the techno-economic modeling we've done, we have a sort of a 17% learning rate across levelized CapEx, and a sort of a 60% decrease in costs across the 3 deployments. So we really think that deployment will help unlock scale.
And on that deployment, are you finding that your customers are willing to kind of make long-term commitments, or are they still kind of saying we need to do pilots, or how, what's their appetite for kind of really, committing for the long term?
I think it's still it is a relatively new industry, and we are, even though we've raced to sort of 3 deployments now internationally, we're a company that's been around for 5 years. So I think there's still a little bit of work to earn that trust and to build those operational hours, and that's something that we're doing every day with our three systems that are continually operating. I think there does need to be, and that's where I think some of the government support comes in as well, which is they can kind of help to backstop some of that risk, or provide maybe sort of a guarantee or some kind of an assurance that there'll be uh, you know something to kind of backstop. and address that risk. And I think there's a number, as the market matures, there's a number of other players. We've spoken to some insurers who are looking at how they can provide products around technology performance, which is really important, and firms that are signed to create kind of financial mechanisms which can shore up offtake structures, which are relatively novel, but really they're just utilizing stock standard products that they've had in their books for decades, but are now applying them to emerging technologies, which is also quite exciting.
And when it comes to the government's appetite for risk underwriting in the UK, but also more broadly, I mean, this has been a year of political upheaval and change, and perhaps support may not be as strong as it once used to be for climate initiatives. Are you feeling that? Are you seeing governments putting back from their support, whether it be on risk or direct funding?
I think it's interesting. Yes and no. I certainly think that in the US, the 45Q tax credit still exists, but I think the broader regulatory environment around the US is pause for concern. But Canada recently, which has its own ITC for carbon removals, extended their tax credit from 2030 to 2035 at the highest rate. And so that's at full value, you're kind of getting a really good incentive to go and do carbon removals in Canada. So that I see that as sort of doubling down in a way. The UK has gone with, I think, a hybrid approach where they're looking at setting up a market framework and price support. And those, I think there's been a lot of work done in the last couple of years, which a lot is coming or has been published this year about the integration of greenhouse gas removals into the UK emissions trading scheme, which is setting a robust legal framework for how to purchase and supply carbon removals, which is a really positive sign. And then also the greenhouse gas removal business model, at the moment tied into the HyNet cluster, but I expect that will expand to other clusters as they kind of mature in their development as well. And so I think actually there is a number of front runners in the field, kind of at least at a government level, that are kind of getting on with the business of designing and implementing this for the long term.
I mean, when we look at the US, clearly the political support for climate initiatives has gone down dramatically, maybe to non-existent. And at the beginning, you mentioned Breakthrough Energy, and I know you used to work at Breakthrough Energy yourself, and they have pulled back from a lot of their climate investment in the UK and Europe. I mean, how do you see that? What do you think the implications are of that kind of political backdrop in terms of being able to drive the industry forward, if foundations and third parties like that really aren't in a position or have chosen not to carry on investing?
Mm. I would challenge that a little bit. I think with the Breakthrough Energy situation, what I think is a slight mischaracterization, because Breakthrough Energy Ventures, the VC fund that supports a range of climate tech companies, including Mission Zero, that's still operational. It's still running as normal. In fact, in September, it launched a new fund that's solely dedicated to sustainable aviation fuels, and it still does a huge amount of work to support innovators on the early side, and projects on the later side. So I think in terms of investment within the climate space, that continues and in fact has increased. It was more the programmatic work around policy and advocacy that Breakthrough decided to wind down. I think that was sort of seen as there were other players in the ecosystem that could take forward that work, and I think that's a sign that it's a relatively robust and diverse ecosystem in terms of the players there. I think it would be, um, you know, unfair to say there are no geopolitical headwinds that are blowing at the moment. Um, I think there is. I think if we sort of take it back to COP, it was the first time that the US didn't have a single delegate, and so there are those sort of uh, absences in kind of like the multilateral process. But I think for those countries and those companies that are serious about taking this forward, it's sort of business as usual. But doing so against the backdrop of some turbulent trade and foreign policy.
And taking all that into consideration, do you think are you feeling positive about the future in terms of the potential for direct air capture and for the market to kick off, or is it going to be a difficult period?
I think I am overall very positive. I think there's the sort of market signals in a number of countries, not the least the UK, that are signaling this is an industry that they think will be important and that they're putting around the structures in which it can be an actual market. I think if I were to be a little critical and maybe to say, with my magic wand, what would I wish for? I do think that the UK has done a great job of setting up a market and the mechanisms around that market, and indeed the kind of standardization that you would really, want in a robust system. That is all incredibly difficult work and is being led by some incredible public servants. That is due to come in by 2028, 2029. And so I think there's a sort of an interim period, which I had conversations, and I believe there will be some funding coming out to address that, some sort of blended finance mechanisms. And I really encourage some of those mechanisms that can help companies bridge that gap between first pilots and demonstrations and then a fully fledged market, because we know that that's not coming until a little bit later. And I think as we said, we learn by doing, and I think there's a need to kind of have that blended support from government and to help those first movers deploy when they still see some risk.
Well, very best of luck with the scaling and for new projects, and also demonstrating the success of the existing ones. It's important to get the case studies, isn't it, to show how things work in real terms. Um, so I just want to say thank you very much to Tom Rollason from Mission Zero Technologies for joining us today and giving us a rundown, both of the company and the broader sector, and some of the policy opportunities, headwinds, and general ways forward. So thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you, Dominic. Pleasure to be here.